The act of betrayal begins with the violation of a sacred trust, a broken bond of friendship, of love, or of loyalty. Friend against friend, brother against brother, comrade against comrade. Played out against a backdrop of power, political intrigue, and human frailty, these stories take on tragic proportions and change the course of history. As new political movements struggle for survival, past loyalties count for nothing except to feed the beast of ambition. Add fervent spiritual beliefs, unswerving loyalty, and demigods with feet of clay. Personal slights and a perceived lack of appreciation combine to create justification. It is the lust for power throughout human history that drives men to reward trust with treachery. The end result is betrayal. Betrayal by assassination. Cain and Abel. A stone hurled in anger leads to a biblical betrayal of blood ties, the murder of one brother by another. Caesar and Brutus, one of the most celebrated political assassinations in history. Friend betrays friend in a desperate bid to stop a grab for power. Jesus and Judas, the ultimate betrayal. A religious prophet betrayed and denied by his disciple for 20 pieces of silver. In each story, betrayal is the common thread. Each tale resonates because of the closeness of the bond. A brother murdered. A friend assassinated. A teacher betrayed. In each case, blood is shed by the person who seems least likely to shed it. From biblical times to the 20th century, grasping for power can lead inexorably toward betrayal and assassination. It is the stuff of human drama. One of the darkest of these stories took place during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s. This is the story of a 14-year friendship that ended in blood. This is the story of Ernst Röhm and Adolf Hitler. Germany in 1918 was a country in chaos. It had just lost the First World War and had been forced at Versailles to sign a humiliating and costly peace treaty. Between the reparations of the treaty and the terrible price the war had already exacted, Germany was economically and politically bankrupt. Breadlines, inflation, and unemployment were the order of the day.
Everybody in Germany thought the Versailles Treaty was beyond the pale, as it were, you know. The public view was that Versailles was a shameful humiliation.
The soldiers' view was that they hadn't been defeated in battle. To the average war veteran, it appeared as if they had been sold out. Disaffection ran rampant. After the abdication of Germany's leader, Kaiser Wilhelm, in 1919, a vacuum was created that political groups on both the left and the right battled to fill. These battles were fought by the Freikorps, volunteer paramilitary units that acted as private armies for various political groups. They turned Germany into a cauldron of violence and hate. One of the strongest of these groups coming to prominence then was the National Socialists, or as they came to be called, the Nazis. They were led by Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born house painter, a former corporal in the German army. His fiery oratory sought to restore the former glory of Germany and a new 1,000-year Reich. Hitler and his party, along with their Freikorps street fighters, were becoming a force to be reckoned with.
Hitler, when he started his movement in Munich, needed, well, we certainly needed men to protect his meetings, strong-armed men when to break up his rivals' meetings, simply people to show violence, to dominate the streets, to frighten people, but also to attract people through violence. And that is how he started his own little corps, who were called the Sturmabteilung. I think that name was adopted fairly early on, SA, Sturmabteilung.
The man who came to take charge of the SA was a tough, brutal army officer possessed of a brilliant organizational mind, a quick temper, and great courage. His name was Ernst Röhm. Röhm first met Hitler in early 1922. Impressed by his personality and oratorical skills, Röhm quickly fell under Hitler's spell. Here was a man he could work with. Röhm would bring men, guns, and political muscle to Hitler's emerging movement.
His be-all and end-all was war, fighting, use of force, violence. He knew nothing else. The Freikorps were the result of these people who had fought in the trenches, who knew nothing but fighting. And Röhm, of course, was a very good example of that.
These were two men who recognized the opportunities created by the political convulsions of the time. Each also recognized in the other what he himself lacked. Ernst Röhm, the second most important man in the growth of the Nazi movement, was a lower-class bully boy, far too blunt to appeal to the common man, much less the elite officer corps, but easily able to galvanize the loyalty of thugs.
Hitler owed a great deal to Röhm in these early days. I mean, one could almost say Hitler was a kind of protege of Röhm.
Röhm was the mercenary, the adventurer, you know, the roughneck, almost the perpetual soldier, one who has found adventure and excitement from the experience of World War I, whereas Hitler was more the visionary, and Hitler had a definition of life that went far beyond the concreteness of just enjoying power. He was really guided by a very clear vision of Germany's future, of where he wanted Germany to be.
The two contrasting types, in fact, perfectly complemented each other. Hitler would be the brains, and Röhm the fist. The two would carry out Hitler's plan of double terror. First, the Nazis would create violent civil unrest. Then they would crush it with terrible brutality.
Röhm was his closest friend in a way in the period before the November 1923. Because without Röhm and Röhm's connections to the Bavarian army, he never could have built up the SA and couldn't have armed his SA troops.
On more than one occasion, Röhm was also able to intervene with higher-ups to keep Hitler from being arrested and the Nazi party dissolved. Hitler and Röhm's SA attempted to take control of the Bavarian government by seizing its leaders at gunpoint in the beer hall putsch in November of 1923. The coup attempt was put down by the Reichswehr, Germany's regular army. Hitler was jailed, and the Nazi party temporarily banned. But through the maneuvers of his friend Röhm and a few other highly placed friends, Hitler, by then somewhat dispirited, was released. Röhm, through force and sheer energy, reorganized the Nazi party, and soon it was again set loose to prey on Germany. The resuscitation of the Nazi party, due in large part to Röhm, was an action that he and Germany would come to regret. The resurgence of the Nazis was astonishing. By the early 1930s, the party had gained enormous power in Germany. Hitler, as Chancellor, controlled the Reichstag, Germany's official parliament and legislature. While party members controlled the press and the police, Röhm's SA thugs dominated the streets. Only the much-loved President Hindenburg and the army stood between Hitler and absolute power.
The head of state, the Reich President von Hindenburg, was obviously failing fast. It was obvious that he didn't have much longer to live and that there would be a question of the succession.
Hitler closed in on his ultimate goal of absolute power as Chancellor and probable successor to President Hindenburg. But his friend Röhm was no closer to his own goal, merging his SA brown shirts with the regular army, with himself as their chief. But in fact, the elitist officer corps had nothing but contempt for the brutish, openly homosexual Röhm and fought him at every turn. As Röhm accumulated enemies, Hitler began to wonder if his friendship with Ernst Röhm had outlived its usefulness.
In addition to the army, Röhm also had rubbed up the wrong way Goering, as head of the Prussian government and of the Prussian police, and Himmler as head of the SS. And both Goering and Himmler were quite willing, and as events turned out, quite able to take advantage of the tension and take advantage of the turn against Röhm in order to further their own interests.
Hermann Goering, along with SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, driven by their own personal ambitions, began to feed Hitler stories that Röhm was plotting to seize control for himself. As the Nazis continued to gain power, the aging President Hindenburg and Vice Chancellor von Papen became more and more concerned with the uncivilized behavior and revolutionary rhetoric of the thuggish brown shirt mobs. The SA's numbers had grown to 3 million men. France and England, alarmed by the explosive growth of the SA, refused the legal German army the right to expand. The army placed the blame squarely on Ernst Röhm. For his part, Hitler, refusing to believe that Röhm was plotting against him, continued to resist the pressure from the army to dismantle the SA. Ernst Röhm was still the only associate close enough to Hitler to address him by the familiar term "du," and Hitler was not yet ready to betray his oldest friend. On the 17th of June, 1934, Vice Chancellor von Papen gave a speech to an influential group of politicians from across Germany's political spectrum. In it, he called for an end to the political double terror being practiced by various groups within Germany. The roar of applause that greeted his speech was echoed throughout Germany. At last, someone had stood up against the Nazi abuse of power. Hitler was unsuccessful in attempts to ban the speech, which only increased the pressure on him to move against Röhm's unruly SA forces. Von Papen was Hindenburg's protege, and Hitler could not afford to offend the president, who not only controlled the army, but would choose his own successor. A scapegoat was needed for the excesses von Papen had spotlighted in his speech. A few days after von Papen's speech, Hitler was ordered to President Hindenburg's estate in East Prussia. There, Hindenburg informed Hitler that unless order was restored immediately throughout Germany, he would declare martial law and the army would take control of the government. Suddenly, on the brink of success, Hitler realized that all he'd worked for might still be snatched away. Röhm and his violent SA had done much to make Hitler chancellor. He had served his purpose. And Hitler now began to wonder if his former friend was more useful to him dead than alive. At the meeting with Hindenburg on the 20th of June, 1934, at the president's estate in East Prussia, Hitler was warned to either curb the lawless elements inside the Nazi party, or the army would be put in control of the government. He left that meeting in a rage. His anger now focused on Ernst Röhm and his brown shirt cronies. And now, suddenly, he began to believe Himmler and Goering's tales of Röhm's plots to undermine him. Röhm had invited Hitler down to Bad Wiese, a spa near Munich, for a weekend meeting to relax and talk over some of the recent problems that had arisen. It was not the first time the two old friends had worked out their problems over a relaxed weekend. Röhm believed, as always, they could resolve these conflicts. Hitler agreed to a breakfast meeting for the next day, June 30th. But at 1 a.m. in his Munich apartment, Hitler received messages simultaneously from Goering and Himmler. Röhm and his SA were planning an uprising to seize power the next day. Whether it was true or not, Hitler grasped the opportunity to deal with Röhm. Now, with the help of Goering and Himmler, he moved swiftly.
It's rather difficult to comprehend why Röhm in June of 1934 didn't back off, because at least with hindsight we can see that the forces arrayed against him were overwhelming and that he was being backed up into a very, very dangerous corner indeed. But I think a couple of things played a very important role in this. One, his friendship with Hitler. And I think that he never could have imagined that his close friend could have done something like this. The second point is that there was, within the Stormtroopers organization, an increasingly impressive cult being built up around Ernst Röhm, sort of the second man of Nazi Germany. He actually began to believe his own propaganda about his indispensability to the Nazi movement and to the Nazi revolution. So I think for these two reasons, it was just unimaginable to him that what in fact did happen could possibly have happened.
In the early morning hours of June 30, 1934, Hitler was joined by his SS bodyguards at his flat in Munich. Edgar Feuchtwanger was 6 years old in 1934 and lived across the way from Hitler's Munich apartment.
What I remember of it was that it was a Saturday morning. I woke up early, of course the light was up early, as it would be the case, and I heard a lot of noise, and so I went to the window and I sort of craned over the windowsill, and I could see that there was a lot of commotion at Hitler's house. You know, there were cars parked, there were people rushing in and out of the door. It's a clatter of jack boots on the pavement and so on.
Hitler gathered his armed column of SS guards and set off for Bad Wiese. Upon arrival, Hitler and his men burst into the hotel housing Röhm and his staff. Hitler banged on Röhm's door. And when Röhm, half asleep, opened the door, Hitler stepped back and yelled, "Arrest him!" Before he could say a word, Röhm was gagged, tied, and taken off to prison. Some of the other SA senior staff were shot on the spot, their bloody bodies dragged out to waiting cars. The same pattern of surprise, capture, and immediate execution of Röhm's senior staff was happening all over Germany.
In addition to the people who are killed in Munich at Hitler's expressed orders, a number of people are killed elsewhere in Germany, and particularly in various parts of Prussia. And these are people who have been singled out, who either have been singled out by Goering, who appears to be the person who is masterminding this operation, and Himmler, or people who were killed at the initiative of local or regional SS leaders.
Ernst Röhm, meanwhile, sat in a cell at Stadelheim prison for 2 days.
Apparently Hitler prevaricated and really wasn't certain what should be done with his erstwhile comrade.
Finally, Hitler commanded Röhm be given a pistol and allowed to do the right thing. Röhm refused, saying, "If Hitler wants to kill me, let him come here and do it himself." 2 SS men then stepped into Ernst Röhm's cell and executed him. Hitler would later justify his act of betrayal by asserting that Röhm had plotted against him. More likely, his close friend Röhm was the only person within the inner circle who would not recognize Hitler's self-appointed position of demigod. For Adolf Hitler, that was the supreme betrayal for which Ernst Röhm paid with his life. In all, over 200 so-called enemies of Germany, and more specifically of Adolf Hitler, were killed during that evening of improvisational slaughter known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army would quickly move to support the Führer, now that the SA's power was broken. The aging Hindenburg would give in and make the little corporal president of Germany. Hitler would manage in one stroke to co-opt the army and consolidate his grip on power. For the German army and the German people, it would prove to be a deal with the devil. In the years to follow, Hitler would not allow Graham's name to be brought up, except in 1945, when trapped in his Berlin bunker, with the Russian troops all around and closing in, half-crazed and heavily drugged. He told others in the bunker that it was he who had been betrayed by the German army, and that Graham's loyal brown shirts would have taken him to victory. The irony of this train of thought was no doubt lost on the leader of the 1,000-year Reich. Across the ocean and half a world away, a dramatically different story was about to unfold. Two men on the edges of American society were taking their first steps toward a friendship that would galvanize a burgeoning movement and ultimately lead to betrayal and assassination. Of radical political movements almost always requires a well of disenfranchised and marginalized citizenry. It's the powerless who gravitate toward religions and political movements that offer them hope. Ferocious loyalty and love are the reciprocation for that hope. The betrayal of that hope is the deepest wound one man can inflict on another. One had been a drug user, a burglar, and a part-time pimp. His name was Malcolm Little, but the world would come to know him as Malcolm X. The other was the spiritual leader of the Nation of Islam, a black fundamentalist religious organization that emphasized black nationalism. Together, these two men would construct a burgeoning empire that would help redefine the struggle for African American civil rights. Their shattered relationship would lead to a shooting that left one dead and the other without the voice that helped to make it. Malcolm Little was a small boy when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president on the promise of a New Deal. But for young Malcolm, who had recently lost his father to a bizarre trolley car accident, and a short while later his mother to a mental institution, there would be no New Deal. His family was broken up, and young Malcolm was sent to live with an older sister. The child of a minority already at the bottom of American society, had not yet finished his downward spiral.
He was on the outer margins of American society at that time. It was how he had come up. Moved to Boston to live with his one of his sisters, and was a porter on a Pullman train going down to Harlem, and moved into that whole incandescent world of hustling and petty crime that escalated. The gambling enforcers were beginning to close in on him in Harlem. He went back to Boston and became a cat burglar, in effect, and would wander into apartments. People were sleeping in the middle of the night and stroll around in stocking feet as they were sleeping in the room, pit of the night, picking up belongings, whatever was available, exacting, as it were, his own kind of reparations for what he felt like society had done to him and to his family. But a headlong, accelerating recklessness set into it. He was arrested, was clapped into prison in Boston, and in a total night now of expectations, and in this extremis, in jail, clapped in this cell that was not much larger than a closet. Islam found him.
White people hated us all, and I wanted to hate myself and my kind. But today I love myself and I love my kind.
His name was Elijah Muhammad. He was the self-proclaimed last messenger of God. Based in Chicago, he spoke to a small part of the black population of self-worth and pride. Locked away in a cell, Malcolm Little, through his brother Filbert, was told about this black teacher who claimed to be the last messenger of Allah, the God of the Muslims. For Malcolm, a man without hope, Elijah Muhammad and his teachings were like a bolt of lightning shattering the darkness of his prison walls. When he was released from prison in 1952, Malcolm moved to Detroit and became active in bringing in new members to the Nation of Islam. At that time, still a small religious group of about 400.
They're passing the basket to the crowd, and I think everybody standing here should put $1 in that basket. Don't you think you should? Sure, these are freedom dollars, brother.
Malcolm became a recruiter. He couldn't understand why all black people in the U.S. were not a part of the Nation of Islam. Because it affirmed their identity as black people, gave them a sense of self-worth, of being somebody.
It was Christianity that taught us that we were found in the jungle, savages, with bones in our noses, that we never had anything, that we never contributed anything to civilization or society.
Malcolm became so actively engaged that he astounded everybody with the amount of energy he had to give to the movement. And later, he went to Chicago to meet Elijah Muhammad.
As a result of the letters he had written to Elijah from prison and his success as a recruiter, Malcolm Little was summoned to Chicago to meet Elijah. There, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad bestowed permanently on him the name Malcolm X.
They had Malcolm to stand up so everyone could see him, and predicted that Malcolm would become one of the leaders in the movement and would never betray him.
In the years to come, Elijah Muhammad would be Malcolm's light and way. Malcolm would give the man who had given him back his self-respect, the love and devotion that a son gives his father. Elijah accepted that love and devotion as his due. Equally important for Malcolm, the separatist preaching of the Nation of Islam gave him a place to channel his rage.
You don't have to be a Muslim to be shot down by police. When they get ready to exercise or execute police brutality, they don't stop to ask, are you a Baptist, Methodist, Muslim, or Catholic, or what have you. As long as your skin is black, you're the victim of police brutality in America.
We use the phrase, the skin is black. Now, I've heard Negro, black, colored. Is there a differentiation?
Yes, the word Negro is a term that was made up by the white man himself during slavery, and no right-thinking black man in America today will accept it as a term to apply to himself. If the white man, no matter how dark he is, still regards himself as a white man, then our people, no matter how light we get, still regard ourselves as black people. If it's good enough for him to be white, it's better for us to be black.
For Elijah, Malcolm, with his charisma and energy, was the voice that could make the messenger's teaching resonate and echo throughout the black community.
Our forefathers went the pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
He understood the psychological oppression that had occurred on black people that caused us to do so many things that were, that were detrimental and that showed a lack of self-esteem and a lack of really strong root pride. And he understood this and he spoke to it.
Malcolm became the chief evangelist for the Nation of Islam, and he would go from city to city with great success, expanding the membership.
When you heard Malcolm X speak, even if you disagreed with every word he said, you could never go back to thinking the way you were thinking before you heard him speak.
Malcolm literally began to grow up in front of his teacher. That growth was duplicated by the love the student had for the teacher and the pride and satisfaction the teacher felt for his student. While Muhammad spoke to a small but loyal following, it was Malcolm who would turn it into a multitude. Malcolm's success in greatly increasing the number of converts to the Nation of Islam and in conveying to them the message of Elijah Muhammad led to his being appointed chief minister of the Harlem Mosque, the Nation of Islam's leading mosque outside Chicago.
And it is from the temple here in New York that Malcolm becomes eventually a national representative of the Nation of Islam and is regarded very highly as the #2 person in the Nation of Islam. That will eventually lead to all kinds of jealousy within the movement.
The Nation of Islam and its chief spokesman were taking on national prominence, in part because of Malcolm's ability to reflect the northern urban black rage that Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement did not.
Negro leader in America today is on the spot when he thinks that he has to defend, that he has to satisfy the white man and the black man too. If you're going to lead black people, fight for black people. Fight for the satisfaction of black people. And you can't always do it and please white people.
The people around Elijah Muhammad started pointing out to the messenger that Malcolm was beginning to get all the press, both black and white. Malcolm was dynamic and at hand. Elijah was frail, asthmatic, and hidden. Muhammad dismissed what his aides told him. He knew they were jealous because Malcolm could do what they couldn't, speak in a voice that made people listen.
Muhammad makes it imperative that a black man who becomes a Muslim works. Right. Get off the welfare. Right. Get out of that compensation line. Right. Be a man.
Malcolm X spread Elijah's message in a voice that was loud and clear. He would soon find out, however, that there was a price to be paid for speaking his own mind. Although a strong personal bond had been forged, some cracks began to appear. Rumors surfaced about Elijah Muhammad's character, suggestions of illicit relationships with young women who worked for him. Malcolm dismissed the rumors as idle gossip, but other important differences in their philosophies were beginning to emerge.
Malcolm always saw the nation as both political and religious, because for him it was the religion that helped him to accept himself as a black person in this white society. For Elijah Muhammad, the movement was strictly religious. Allah would be the one that would punish the white devil. Malcolm, however, did not want to wait on God. He always saw people as taking the initiative, but he could not articulate that too sharply because it would lead to conflict with Elijah Muhammad.
Disaffections and alienations, far deeper, more Arabesque, had already begun to set in with Malcolm, and for that matter with Elijah. And they were progressively beginning to feel themselves mutually offended and betrayed by the other. Inevitable. Malcolm was becoming the Nation of Islam, not Elijah Muhammad.
At the same time, the rumors of Elijah's infidelities with various Nation of Islam secretaries continued to come to Malcolm's attention.
And the final straw came when Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace, and he were talking, and in that conversation he discovered that Wallace knew too. And that Wallace told him about those infidelities.
Malcolm confronted Elijah. Muhammad was insulted. How dare his protege question the last messenger of Allah? Malcolm was confused. The trust and hope he had in Elijah Muhammad was shaken to its core.
It was as if something in nature had failed, as if the sun had died. This disillusionment that he came across with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad then, in reaction to Malcolm's unhappiness and anger, ultimately repudiated Malcolm.
The rift between Muhammad and Malcolm widened to a chasm in November of 1963 in the wake of the assassination of President John Kennedy, a man Elijah knew was especially popular among the black population.
But Malcolm celebrated it as the chickens coming home to roost. Elijah allowing that he was glad that it happened.
And of course the papers took it out and made it sound as though he was literally jumping up and down and doing a jig over the assassination of Kennedy, which it was not at all.
Well, that did set off a shiver of a bit of a national scandal that discomfited even Elijah Muhammad. And he called Malcolm in and rebuked him for that comment and said that he was going to have to place him on suspension for 90 days. Malcolm received that with the appearance of appropriate modesty, indignance, and humility. But from his street hustling days, he knew he was being set up.
Malcolm accepted the punishment until he began to realize his silence was meant to be permanent. For a man who had found himself, partially through his ability to speak to the masses, this was intolerable. Suddenly, Elijah Muhammad began to take seriously the stories some of the brothers were telling him about Malcolm. Criticisms began to appear in the pages of Muhammad Speaks, the paper started by Malcolm, but now controlled by Elijah's closest lieutenants, and in which nothing was written without the messenger's approval.
Elijah was even quoted as complaining, all I hear is Malcolm this and Malcolm that. He's got to understand who made him. The classic rivalry between the son is brought up and increases the father's kingdom. And the father beginning to become suspicious, resentful, and suspicious of even what his son has given him. And imagining the son, wishes to displace him. That story takes on Greek symmetries.
Malcolm decided the only course to take was to resign. He set up a news conference. All the press turned out. Malcolm at this point was a major media figure. He announced the formation of his Muslim Mosque, Inc. The student was going to teach the teacher. Malcolm was becoming a painful thorn in the side of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. For them, Malcolm's departure and success marked him not only as a deserter, but a rival. And to the Nation of Islam, rivalry was intolerable. After his break with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm set up his own mosque called Muslim Mosque Incorporated.
Malcolm did not leave the Nation of Islam eagerly. And without regret, he left it, in fact, despite everything, very reluctantly. After all, it was the only true home he had ever known.
Right after the break with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm finally made his long-planned pilgrimage to Mecca. The trip both changed and broadened his views. Among other things, he would no longer refer to white people as devils. His vision became more humanistic and ecumenical.
When I was in Arabia during the pilgrimage, I had many different occasions when I would be involved with persons who would be considered white in America, who would be called white. They had blue eyes, blonde hair, and white skin. Yet they themselves didn't act like American whites act toward non-whites. There was a bond, a mutual understanding. There was an attitude of brotherhood practiced at all times.
He began to reach out to everyone, not only the black community. Nation of Islam leaders feared this would only increase Malcolm's following and diminish their own.
All of the so-called Negro leaders should try some way to forget our differences. I'm willing to forget anything that any Negro leader has ever said bad about me. And as I said earlier, I'm praying that they will also be able to forget the many bad things that I've said about them.
Malcolm was winning more and more converts. As his popularity continued to rise, he began receiving death threats.
Who he had been before this pilgrimage to Mecca was now stalking him and would smite him. He would be in this strange sense stopped by his own hand.
Malcolm was finding it difficult to move away from the violent rhetoric of his past.
I have seen and bear witness as to how Malcolm was raised from a level of nothing to a place of honor and respect throughout the world as a result of Mr. Muhammad's direction. Because now I see my brother pursue a dangerous course which parallels that of the precedent set by Judas, Brutus, and Benedict Arnold, and others who betray the honor and trust relationship between them and their leaders.
We were aware that, that he was in danger. I don't think I really deep down believed that it was actually going to happen, though.
On Sunday, the 14th of February, the death threats took on new meaning when Malcolm and his family were awakened in the middle of the night by fire.
But see, when his home was firebombed, which had been that previous Sunday, that had put his wife, who was then pregnant, and his 4 daughters in danger. And I think for the first time, with the firebombing, when it had actually done that it had really shook him.
By this point, Malcolm was convinced that the nation and Elijah's followers were going to kill him. 2 days before his death, he said to Life magazine photographer Gordon Parks, "It's a time for martyrs now, and if I'm going to be one, it will be in the name of brotherhood." On the morning of February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X drove to Harlem and parked his car 20 blocks south of the Audubon Ballroom on 145th Street. He had decided his own car was too easily identifiable. He caught a ride the remainder of the way. People at the Audubon noticed how exhausted he looked. He talked to his bodyguards, who wanted to search and stop anyone seemingly dangerous from coming into the ballroom. But Malcolm refused to have the way barred to anyone. He was a man of principle, and he would not hide. 4 men with guns hidden, who were not there to hear a minister, went up the stairs.
I went to the Audubon that day, the 21st, on Sunday, and as we were going up the stairs, we couldn't help but sense that people seemed a little bit nervous about something.
I was sitting in the lobby area when I heard him say, "Assalamu alaikum," and then the next thing I heard was the shots.
It was very sudden, where these 2 people jumped up, it seemed like, and said, one said, "Get your hands on my pocket," and everybody was looking at them, and then the people up front, I guess they were all part of their team, started shooting at Malcolm.
And I heard, people screaming and getting knocked down, and I got knocked down on the floor. So I lay on the floor until I heard the shooting stop, then I jumped up and I ran down and I jumped on stage, and I saw him, laying there on stage, and someone had pulled his shirt open, and I saw the bullet holes in his body.
Seeing Malcolm on the floor, then I went right there, and I put his head up on my lap. I was hoping that maybe he could breathe easier.
One of the gunmen, Thomas Hayer, a member of the Nation of Islam, was apprehended outside the ballroom. 2 other fellow members later would be arrested and charged. Hayer would confess and name 2 other members of the Nation of Islam as his accomplices.
Way I see it, Malcolm is the victim of his own Christian. He preached violence, and so he becomes the victim of it.
While Elijah Muhammad would always disavow any responsibility, there is little doubt that Malcolm had been murdered by Elijah's followers. For the people around these 2 men, only one word applied: betrayal. For the Nation of Islam, Malcolm had turned on the man who saved him. For Malcolm's people, a jealous mentor had taken revenge on the student who had surpassed him.
They certainly succeeded in erasing what they considered to be this intolerable outrage and renegade, Malcolm, and also effectively erased what Malcolm, through that last year, was evolving into. A figure becomes defined and affirmed from out of that violence, that violent extinction. And in the case of Malcolm, it has become his prior self, his pre-pilgrimage self. The anger, the malevolence, and the vituperation. That's the Malcolm that Malcolm was trying to leave, to move away from. And that's the Malcolm the pre-Mecca Malcolm that now in the general mind is who he was.
In February of 1976, near the 11th anniversary of Malcolm's death, the son of the now deceased Elijah Muhammad renamed the Nation of Islam Mosque in Harlem the Malcolm X Mosque. Malcolm's last words were, "Assalamu alaikum," peace be unto you. Wa alaikum salam, and unto you, peace. No one knows for sure the extent to which the Nation of Islam was involved in the assassination of Malcolm X. What we do know is a paradox. Malcolm's death only served to diminish Elijah's reputation, while Malcolm's voice and his message of self-reliance and black pride and brotherhood amongst men is being heard by greater numbers of people than ever before. We have seen that betrayal by assassination overrides any loyalties, no matter how old, no matter how valued. In the end, friendship is often sacrificed to the beast of ambition. From the age of Cain and Abel, Caesar and Brutus, Jesus and Judas, Adolf Hitler and Ernst Röhm, to Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. Throughout history, in the killing fields of politics, friendship is just another casualty on the road to power.
Coming up next, authorities look into keeping the law with car crimes on Justice Files. Then head to Australia for a closer look at the red kangaroo on Wild Discovery, only on the Discovery Channel. Explore your world.